She was the oldest woman at the auction. A young cowboy chose her over 3 pretty girls. The bid sheet had 6 names on it when I walked in, and I didn't look at a single one of them. I want to tell you why. Not to make myself sound better than I was. I wasn't anything special at 28. I had 160 acres of hard ground south of Ridge Creek, a mule with a bad hock, and maybe $11 to my name after I'd paid for the winter's seed. I want to tell you why because it's the kind of thing a man only does once in his life, if he's lucky, and I never fully understood it until years after it was done. The auction was Carver Tillman's idea. He ran the land office out of a converted feed store on the south end of Garnet, and he had a talent for turning other people's misery into a social occasion. 4 women had come in on the Wednesday stage, widows, a couple of them, one woman whose husband had gone east for work and never come back, and one who'd answered an advertisement in a church circular. They needed husbands or at least a season's arrangement. Farmers and ranchers needed hands and housekeepers, and sometimes more than that. Tillman had the paperwork. All it cost was an afternoon. My neighbor Dix Harlow dragged me there. Dix was 34, already had a wife, but she'd gone to her sister's in Pueblo for the winter, and he said he was going stir-crazy. What he meant was he wanted somewhere to be and something to watch. He wasn't a bad man, he just liked a crowd. We rode in on a Thursday, which was a mistake because it gave us the whole evening in Garnet before the Friday auction, and Dix spent most of that evening in the Lucky Dog working through the better part of a bottle of rye, and telling me what a young fool I was for not already having a woman. "You're 28, he kept saying. 28 and you're farming 160 acres by yourself. You know what that gets you? A bad back before 40 and a cold bed until you die." I told him I was fine. I told him I wasn't there to buy a wife. I told him I'd come along because I needed to pick up a hame strap and a new draw knife from the hardware, which was true, and because it was the first week of November and I hadn't spoken to a soul in 11 days other than the mule, which was also true. He said, "Well, look anyway." I said, "I'll look." That was a Thursday night. By Friday afternoon, something had changed in me that I still can't fully explain, except that when I try, I keep coming back to her hands. The auction was held in the big room behind the land office. Tillman had dragged in chairs from the church and the schoolhouse both, and set out 2 lanterns even though it was the middle of the day, because the only window faced north and didn't give much. About 30 men came. Some I knew, some I didn't. Homesteaders, a couple of merchants, a rancher from up near the Laramie line who'd ridden 2 days. Young men. Old men. One man who must have been pushing 70, had a white beard down to his collarbone and smelled of pine tar, sat in the front row like he was settling in for church. Tillman stood at the front with his ledger and introduced the 4 women one by one. The first 3 came out together and stood in a line, and Tillman read their names and what they were looking for: short-term arrangements or proper marriage, skills they had, land or money they might bring to a match. The room woke up when they came in. Men sat forward. There was talking, and some of it I'm not proud to say I heard and didn't protest. The 3 were young, 20, maybe 22. One had red hair. One was tall and stood very straight. One had eyes that caught even the bad light from those 2 lanterns. They were pretty girls, all 3 of them, and they knew it, or at least they knew what the room wanted from them, and they bore it with more dignity than the room deserved. I watched them, and I felt nothing particular. Not coldness, not indifference. Just nothing that pulled me one way or another, which was strange because I wasn't a man who didn't notice women. I noticed them fine. I'd had a girl in Ridge Creek 2 years before, Marta Fain, and that had gone the way things go when a man's too broke and too far out on the land to be reliable company. But I watched those 3, and I kept sitting where I was. Then Tillman said, "And finally, Mrs. Cora Voss." She came through the door from the back room, and I understood immediately, from the way the room shifted, that she was not what they'd come for. She was 44 years old. I found that out later. In that moment, she looked to me like a woman who had worked hard for a good long while and was not in any way sorry about it. She was not tall. Her hair was dark with gray coming through it, pulled back plain. She had the kind of face that has had weather on it, not ruined, just settled, like good saddle leather. Her dress was clean and pressed, but it was not new, and she had not done anything to it to try to make it new. She walked to where the others stood, and she looked at the room without flinching. Just looked, not defiant. Just clear-eyed, the way a person looks at something they are assessing on its merits. The room did not lean forward for her. Tillman read her particulars. widow of 7 years, from Hays, Kansas originally. No property of her own but skilled with accounts, with livestock, with a kitchen and a garden. Looking for a proper arrangement, not less. He finished, and there was a kind of quiet that was the worst thing I'd ever heard in a room full of men. Not cruelty, just absence, like she wasn't quite there to them. And then something happened in me that I've thought about many times since. I wasn't angry exactly. I don't have a good word for it. It was the kind of feeling that starts in your chest and moves down into your hands, like when you see a good horse being sold wrong. When you see something that has real value, and the people around you are too busy looking at the shine to see the bone underneath. I raised my hand. You have to understand what that room thought of me in that moment. I was 28. Half these men were older than me, and some of them had known my father, and a few of them had done business with my father, and were not entirely convinced I'd grown into a man, yet worth doing business with. My 160 acres was still called the Carver place by half the county because old Mitch Carver had homesteaded it before I bought it, and some people don't update their maps quick. I had not established myself in any large way. I was young and I was quiet, and I did not have the kind of money in my pocket that says a man can be taken seriously. When I raised my hand, Dix Harlow grabbed my elbow. He said, quiet and fast, "What are you doing?" I said, "Bidding." He said, "On her." He didn't mean it cruel. I want to be fair to Dix. He was just confused. He'd expected me to raise my hand for one of the young ones, if I raised it at all, and the fact that I was raising it for Cora Voss did not compute in the machinery of his thinking. I said, "Yes, on her." He let go of my elbow. Tillman said, "We have a bid from," he looked at me, Mr. Ned Carlin, $120 for a 6-month working arrangement with option to formalize. That was what I had, all of it, my winter seed money plus the $11. It was a stupid amount to spend, and I had spent it before I finished deciding to. The room was quiet. The pine tar man in the front row turned around and looked at me. A couple of the young men near the back wall looked at me too, not unkind, more like they were watching something they didn't understand and wanted to. Nobody else bid. Tillman said, "Mr. Carlin at 120, going once, going twice." I looked at Cora Voss, and she was looking at me. She was not looking at me the way the young men near the wall were looking at me. She was not confused or touched or even grateful. She was doing what she'd been doing since she walked through that door. She was assessing. I could feel it. 2 gray eyes, steady as a surveyor's level, taking me apart piece by piece. My age. My coat, which was good wool but worn. My hands, something about my shoulders or my posture. I don't know everything she read. I know I sat up straighter without deciding to. Tillman said, "Sold to Mr. Carlin." We did not speak the first day. I want to be careful here because people tell this wrong. They want to make it soft immediately. The young man kind and the older woman grateful, and the two of them talking all through the first evening like something had cracked open. That's not what happened. What happened was I signed the papers. She signed the papers. Tillman gave us each a copy. I told her I had a wagon out front, and she said she had one trunk and she'd get it herself. She got it herself. It was a good-sized trunk, and she carried it without asking me to watch. I watched anyway. She loaded it into the wagon bed and climbed up to the bench without help and sat there and looked forward and waited. I climbed up the other side, and we drove out of Garnet in the early afternoon, and neither of us said a word for about 6 miles. I was not uncomfortable with that. I am by nature a quiet man, but after a while I became aware that her silence was different from my silence. Mine was just the absence of talk. Hers had texture. She was thinking something and keeping it to herself, and the keeping of it was not effortless. There was a small tightness around her jaw that came and went. I said, "It's about 9 more miles." She said, "I know." I looked at a map. I said, "Of course." She said, "You're young." I said, "I'm 28. She said, "I know how old you are." I read the form. I said, "All right." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Carlin." I said, "I didn't think you were." She said, "What did you think?" I didn't have a ready answer for that. I thought for a while, and she let me think. The road went through a cut between 2 low hills and came out into the flat, and the afternoon light was doing what it does in November, coming in low and hard from the southwest, turning everything the color of old copper. I said, I thought you looked like a person who knew what she was doing. She turned and looked at me for a long moment. Not warm, not cold, just that same level assessment. She said, that's an odd thing to pay $120 for. I said, maybe. I didn't have a better use for it. She turned back to the road. After a while she said, that was all your seed money. I said, yes. She said, that was foolish. I said, I know. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride, but the tightness around her jaw was gone. The house was what it was. I want to say that plainly so you understand what she walked into. The house was a two-room soddy that I'd been improving since I bought the place, which meant one room had proper plank walls now and a plank floor, and the other still had dirt walls and a dirt floor with a rag rug over most of it. The stove was a good stove, big iron monarch, that had come with the place and was the best thing in it. The bed was in the planked room, and I'd put a cot in the other room, which was both the kitchen and what I used as a sitting room when I sat, which was not often. She stood in the doorway of the first room, the kitchen, the dirt wall room, and looked at it for a long time without expression. Then she said, "Where do you keep your wood?" I showed her. She said the stack was too close to the house. I said I'd move it. She said it needed a better cover, and I said I'd do that too. She said the stovepipe had a separation in it up near the top, and if I didn't fix it soon the whole room would fill with smoke the first cold night. I looked up and she was right. I didn't know how I'd missed it. I said, I'll get up there tomorrow. She said, today. I got up there that day. That was how the first week went. She was not harsh and she was not warm. She was practical in a way that I had not encountered before, or at least not from someone who was doing it on my behalf. She went through the house and the outbuildings the way a good buyer goes through a property, noting, cataloging, ranking what needed fixing by urgency. By the end of the first week, there was a list on the table, written in a very small and very exact hand, 14 items long, ranked 1 to 14 with estimated times and materials beside each. I read it twice. I said, that's right about all of it. She said, I know. I said, what's 14? She said, the window in the back room needs a new sash. It's not urgent, I put it last. I said, how do you know all this? She said, 7 years on my own. You learn to read a place. I said, your husband, when he died, did you have help? She said, no. She said it the way a person closes a drawer. Not angry, just done. I didn't ask again. The cold came in the 3rd week of November, and it came hard, the way it does on the high plains, not gradual but all at once, like something that had been waiting just north of the ridge for its moment and finally got it. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a morning. By the 2nd day, there was snow. I was out mending fence in it when I heard her come up behind me. She had on her heavy coat and her good boots, and she was carrying a bucket of oat mash for the horses, which I hadn't asked her to do. I said, you don't have to do that. She said, I know. The roan has a stone bruise on his off front. You've been favoring him, but he needs the extra feed or he'll lose condition faster than he can recover. I looked at her. I said, how'd you know about the stone bruise? She said, I pick up feet when I feed. You should too. I went back to the fence. She went to the water trough with the oat mash and stood there while the horses ate, her back to me, her coat dark against the white of the snow. I don't know what I had expected from the arrangement. I don't think I'd expected anything precisely. I'd acted on something that felt right, and then I was here, in the cold, mending fence with a woman 20 feet away who was more capable than any person I'd shared a property with, and who was making it very plain that she wasn't here because she needed saving, and that if I was operating under the impression that I'd rescued her, I needed to correct that impression. I appreciated that, more than I knew how to say at the time. The first time she laughed was over the mule. The mule's name was Tom, and he had a bad hock, as I said, and a worse temperament. And what I had not told Cora because it had not come up was that Tom had a specific grudge against me that went back to the previous spring when I'd had to drain an abscess on his near foreleg, and he'd remembered it and was keeping a running account. She came out one morning in late November and found me standing 20 feet from the barn door, just standing there, and Tom standing in the barn doorway, just standing there, and us looking at each other. She said, what are you doing? I said, waiting. She said, for what? I said, for him to forget why he's angry. She looked at Tom. She looked at me. She said, he's not going to forget. I said, I know, but I'm hoping. She laughed. It was short, just a short sound, not long, but it was real. It was not a polite sound or a social sound. It was the laugh of a person who has been caught off guard by something genuinely funny when they weren't braced for it. Tom put his ears back and she walked right past me and past Tom and into the barn and came back out with his halter and his lead rope. She held the halter out toward him, not approaching, just holding it there. She waited. He looked at her for a while, then he walked forward and put his nose into the halter. She said, he doesn't know you well enough yet to forgive you. You have to earn it. She handed me the lead rope. I stood there holding it and Tom stood there tolerating me. I said, how do you do that? She said, I don't hold grudges, he can tell. She walked back toward the house, and I stood there with the mule and thought about that for a long time. December. There are things I want to tell you about December that are hard to put in order because they didn't happen in order. Not really. They accumulated. Like the snow does on the high plains, not all at once but layer on layer, each new inch covering the last until what you're looking at is nothing like what was there before. She was up before me every morning. This was the first thing. I had always been an early riser, 4:30 in summer, 5 in winter, and I had been proud of it in a quiet way, the way a man is proud of a small discipline. For 3 weeks she was already at the stove when I came out. The coffee was made. The kitchen was warm. She would be at the table with her mending or her accounts, a lamp pulled close, and she would look up when I came in and say good morning, and that was that. I started getting up earlier. I don't fully know why, not to impress her. More that I wanted to be there when she was, to be in the same space of the morning rather than arriving into it after it had already been established as hers. One morning I came out and she wasn't there. The stove was cold. I stood in the kitchen confused for a moment. It was 4:05, dark as the inside of a hat, and then I heard her out back. I went out and she was standing by the edge of the property, where the ground broke away toward the creek, and she was looking north. Just standing there in her coat with her hands in her pockets, looking north. I said, Cora. She said, there's weather coming. I looked north. There was nothing to see, just dark. I said, how do you know? She said, the way the air smells, and the horses were restless last night. She was right. The storm hit 2 days later. 3 feet of snow in 36 hours and a wind out of the northwest that found every gap in the Saudi's walls and let you know about them. We got the horses and the mule inside the barn. We got the chickens, what there were of them, into a box in the kitchen, which I hadn't done before and which made the kitchen smell extremely like chickens, but she didn't complain. We got the wood stacked inside both rooms and the water buckets filled before the pump froze. For 2 days and 2 nights we couldn't go out. I want to say that plainly too because I think it's important. 2 days and 2 nights in 2 rooms, snowed in, with a woman I had known for 5 weeks and still hadn't fully taken the measure of. The Saudi was not large. The kitchen was maybe 12 feet by 12. The sleeping room was smaller. We were not awkward. That surprised me. We talked more in those 2 days than we had in all the weeks before. Not about important things, not about the past or the future or the shape of what we were doing. We talked about the land, about what I wanted to do with the south pasture, about whether it was worth putting in a root cellar in the spring or waiting another year. About the roan's hock and whether it needed a different kind of shoe or just rest. About the accounts, which she had gone over and put into better order than they had ever been in my hands, and she explained to me without condescension where I had been losing money and where I could stop. At some point on the second night I said, how did you end up in Hayes? She said, my husband's family was there. I said, and after he died? She thought for a moment. She said, his family was kind, but it was their grief too, and I started to feel like I was living inside someone else's sorrow. So I left. I said, where did you go? She said, east for a year, then west again. I tried teaching for a while, then I tried keeping books for a merchant in Dodge. Then I answered an advertisement. She looked at me and said, yours is the 3rd arrangement I've answered for. I hadn't known that. I felt something strange at that, not jealousy, not exactly, but something close to it, something protective and a little foolish. I said, what happened with the other 2? She said, the first man was older than he'd said and sicker than he'd said, and he died 8 weeks after I arrived. The second man had a drinking problem he'd omitted from the advertisement. I left after 2 months. She said this all very level, very plain. But I watched her hands on the table, and they were still for a long time after she stopped talking, and then they weren't. I said, "I'm sorry." She looked at me. She said, "It's all right." She meant it. She had already made peace with it, or as much peace as a person can make with that kind of thing. But I sat there in the lamplight with the storm pressing on the walls of the soddy, and I thought about what it must have taken to do that twice and then get on a stage and do it again. To be practical enough and tough enough and determined enough to keep trying when most people would have found a reason to stop. I thought about that auction room and those 30 men looking at the young ones, and I felt again that thing in my chest and my hands, and this time I recognized it more clearly. It was respect, old-fashioned, simple, very large respect. The storm broke on the third morning. We dug out together. That is a particular thing, digging out after a big storm, the particular quality of the light on fresh snow, the silence, the smell of cold that is different from any other cold, the way your breath hangs, and the effort of the shovels. We worked for 4 hours side by side, clearing the barn and the path to the well and the coop. She was not dainty about it. She shoveled like someone who had shoveled before and expected to shovel again and had no interest in being noticed doing it. I had to ask her twice to take a break, and the second time she said, "I'll stop when I'm tired." I said, "All right." She said, not breaking stride with the shovel, "You don't hover well." I said, "I'm not hovering." She said, "What would you call it?" I said, "Supervising." She stopped shoveling and turned and looked at me, and it took her a second, but she laughed again. Longer this time. She put the shovel against the barn wall and put her hands on her knees and laughed for a good 5 seconds, and then straightened up and took the shovel back and kept going. That was the second time. I thought about collecting those, the times she laughed. I did not think about why I was thinking about that. January. The thing about living with a competent person is that it changes you. I don't mean it improves you, or not only that. I mean it changes the shape of how you move through your days. When you are alone on 160 acres, you develop a kind of narrow efficiency. Everything timed to what one person can do, every decision made inside the limits of one person's reach. You stop even imagining differently because the imagining costs something and you can't afford the cost. Cora had started the root cellar plans herself, on paper with measurements. She had talked to the rancher 2 properties north, a man named Walt Prout who I didn't know well, and found out what he'd paid for the labor and the timber for his own root cellar 3 years back. She had revised the accounts and found, as I said, that I was bleeding money in 2 specific places that could be fixed. She talked me through all of it at the table one evening in a way that was careful and thorough, and that assumed I was intelligent and could follow her reasoning, which I appreciated deeply because not everyone had always assumed that. I said, "You should have been running this place from the start." She said, "You were doing fine." I said, "I was doing all right. You're doing better." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "We're doing better." Something in that, the way she said it, the simplest kind of correction, just the pronoun changed, but it landed. I said, "Yes, we are." She got sick in February. Not badly sick. A chest cold that came on fast and settled in and made her cough in a way that tightened something in me I hadn't known was there to tighten. She would not stop working. I told her to rest, and she said she was resting as much as she needed, and I said that was not the same thing as resting as much as she should, and she said those were 2 different questions, and she knew her own body. I did not argue with that. She was right, and I knew she was right. What I did instead was I started getting up at 3:30 instead of 4, and I had the stove already hot and the coffee made when she came out, and I had the morning chores done before she woke so that there was less for her to do and I could not be accused of telling her to rest. She noticed, of course she noticed. On the 3rd morning she came out and looked at the stove and looked at me and said, "You've been up since before 4. I said, "I like the early morning." She said, "You've always liked it at 4, not 3:30. I said, "I'm trying something different." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Ned." That was the first time she had used my given name. In 2.5 months of living in the same 2 rooms, she had called me Mr. Carlin. I don't know if that was propriety or distance. When she said Ned, it was neither. It was just my name. She said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not going to fall apart." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me. I looked at her. The lamp was burning between us on the table, and the stove was putting out a good heat, and outside the wind was doing what it does in February on the high plains. She said, "Thank you." She did not say it small. She said it the way a person says something they mean, and are not embarrassed to mean, and are not going to dress up with anything extra. I said, "You're welcome." She sat down and I poured the coffee, and we sat there in the early morning of the high plains in February, 2 people in 2 chairs with 2 cups, and that was enough. By March, she was well. By March, we were something I didn't have a word for and wasn't sure I needed one. There is a quality to a partnership that develops between 2 people who are both good at working and both willing to do it and who have been honest with each other in the small ways, which are harder than the large ways. The small honesty is your stovepipe needs fixing. Your accounts have a problem. You hover. You're up too early. It's the hardness of small truthfulness, the willingness to say the true thing without wrapping it. We had that by March. She had opinions, strong ones, and she stated them plainly and was willing to be told she was wrong and was not always wrong. She thought the south pasture should be put into hay this year instead of grain. I thought grain. We argued it for an entire evening, civilly, working through the soil and the market and the water situation, and at the end of it I said she was right, and she said she might have overstated the water problem, and I said no, she had stated it correctly. She looked at me over the table and said, "We could split it." I said, "Half hay, half grain." She said, "See how both do this year and decide from there." I said, "That's smart." She said, "It's practical." I said, "Those aren't different things." She looked at me for a moment, not the assessing look, something else. Something that took the assessing look and added something warmer to it that I hadn't seen before. She said, "No, I suppose they're not. There was one evening in March I want to tell you about separately. I had been into Ridge Creek for supplies, and I came back in the late afternoon with the wagon, and as I came over the last rise before the property, I could see the house and the barn and the smoke from the chimney, and it is hard for me to say what that was, coming over that rise and seeing those things. I had come over that rise maybe 300 times since I bought the place. I had seen the house and the barn and the chimney smoke. But this time there was a lamp already in the window, which meant she was in the kitchen, and the horses were in their paddock, and the mule was in his, and the whole thing had a quality of order, of rightness, like pieces that had been arranged carelessly for years and had finally been put where they belonged. I sat on the wagon bench for a moment before I drove down. I thought, this is what it's supposed to look like. Then I drove down and put the horses up and went inside. She was at the stove with her back to me, and she said, without turning, the roan threw a shoe. "I got word to Walt Prute's boy to tell the smithy in Ridge Creek. He'll be out tomorrow." I said, "How'd you know about the shoe?" She said, "He was favoring again at the gate when I brought them in." I said, "Right." She said, "I made elk stew. There's bread." I said, "Cora." She turned. I said, Are you all right here?" She looked at me for a moment with that level look. She said, "Why?" I said, "I just want to know." She said, "I'm more than all right here." I said, "Good." She said, "Why are you asking?" I said, "I just coming over the rise tonight I could see the lamp in the window, and I thought I wanted to know if it was good for you too." She stood there with a wooden spoon in her hand and the stove behind her, and she looked at me for a long time, long enough that I felt it. She said, "Ned, it's the first place in 7 years that has felt like mine." She said it plain, no decoration. And I felt the weight of that, the 7 years of it, the 2 failed arrangements before this one, the trunk she had carried herself, the way she had looked at that auction room with those clear eyes that were not going to beg. I said, "It is yours." She said, "I know." April. The ground thawed. We put in the root cellar, me and Walt Prute's 2 boys, and she supervised, which was not my idea but theirs. Walt Prute's boys had done a root cellar before, and they recognized someone who knew the measurements and the drainage requirements and the timber spacing, and they figured out quickly who to ask when they had a question. I watched her tell a 19-year-old boy the correct way to angle the drainage, and watched him listen without question, and understood that this was what it looked like when a person had genuine competence and other people could feel it. I told her that evening, I said, "Prute's boys deferred to you." She said they were smart enough to know who knew. I said, "Not everyone is." She said, "No." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You were." I said, "I was what?" She said, smart enough to know, "At the auction. I watched you and I thought he's not buying hope or looks or a remedy for loneliness. He's actually seeing what's there." I didn't say anything for a moment because I wasn't sure I'd earned that fully. I had acted on instinct, and the instinct had turned out to be right, but I hadn't been so articulate about it as she was making it sound. I said, "I'm not sure I thought it through that clearly." She said, "Maybe not, but you saw it. That's rarer than thinking it through." I held on to that. I'll be honest with you, I held on to that. The arrangement was for 6 months with option to formalize. 6 months from the first Friday in November was the first Friday in May. I did not bring it up. I am not entirely proud of that, but I want to be honest. I did not bring it up because I did not want to create a moment where the question could be answered wrong, and I had got, by April, very far from the state of mind in which that could be easily survived. She brought it up herself on a Wednesday in the last week of April. We were at the table after supper, the accounts between us, the lamp burning, and she said, "The 6 months are almost up." I said, "Yes." She said, "You haven't said anything." I said I didn't want to push. She looked at me with an expression that was not quite the assessing look and not quite the warm look, but somewhere in between. She said, "You paid $120. I said I did. She said, "That was your seed money." I said it was. She said, "And you're not going to push." I said no. She was quiet for a while. Outside there was the sound of the night wind and the horses moving in the paddock and the small sounds of a place settling in the dark. She said, "You know what I thought when you raised your hand at that auction?" I said, "What?" She said, "I thought he's young and he's making a mistake, and I hope he knows that." I said I didn't know it. She said, "No, I could see that." She looked down at the table for a moment. She said, "And then I thought, when was the last time someone made a mistake for me?" She said it very quietly, not for effect, just saying a true thing. She said it was a long time. I said, "Cora." She looked up. I said, "I'd like to formalize the arrangement." She said, "I know." I said, "What do you think?" She looked at me for a long moment with those clear gray eyes. She was not assessing me this time, or not only that. She was doing something else. She was letting me see that she had already decided, had maybe already decided a while ago, and had been waiting for me to say the words out loud. She said, "I think yes." I said, "Just yes." She said, "Ned, I stopped answering advertisements the week after I got here." I sat with that for a moment. She said, "You needed a woman who knew what she was doing. I needed a man who could see past what everyone else was looking at. Here we are." I said, "Here we are." She reached across the table and put her hand on top of mine. Her hand was not soft. It was the hand of a woman who had worked hard her whole life, who had carried her own trunk and shoveled her own snow, and known for 7 years what it meant to have no one reliable to hand anything to. It was work-worn, and it was sure, and it was warm, and she left it there, not to comfort me or signal something, but simply because she meant to. I turned my hand over and held hers. Outside, the night wind moved across the high plains, and the horses were quiet in their paddock, and the lamp burned between us, and that was the whole of it. The whole of what I needed. 2 people in 2 chairs at a table on 160 acres of hard ground, with a list of 14 items, and one of them the window sash that could wait, and the south pasture half in hay and half in grain, and a mule in the barn that had learned to tolerate me. She had come in through a door that a room full of men had not wanted her to walk through. She had stood there with her work-worn hands and her gray-threaded hair and her clear, steady eyes, and she had looked at them looking at her, and she had not flinched or begged or dimmed herself even a little. And I had raised my hand. I have not been sorry a single day. We were married in May in the land office in Garnet. Tillman did the paperwork. Dix Harlow was there. The pine tar man was not there, but I thought about him, sitting in the front row with his white beard, turning to look at me when I raised my hand. Dick shook my hand afterward and said, "I'll be honest, I didn't understand it at the time." I said, "I know." He said, "I understand it now." I said, "What changed?" He looked at Cora, who was talking to Tillman's wife by the window, and he said, "I watched her run your place for 6 months." I said, "She runs it better than I do." He said, "That's what I mean." After the ceremony, we drove back out to the property in the wagon, the two of us on the bench. And when we came over the last rise and saw the house and the barn and the smoke from the chimney, I stopped the wagon again. She knew why. She had seen me do it before, just once, that evening in March when I'd come back from Ridge Creek and sat on the bench before driving down. She sat beside me and looked at what I was looking at. She said, "It looks right." I said, "Yes." She said, "It looks like it belongs to people." I said, "It does." We sat there for another moment, and then she took the reins out of my hands, not impatiently, just with the same practical certainty with which she did everything, and clicked the horses forward and drove us down to the place that was ours. The lamp would be in the window every night from then on. I never once came over that rise and saw it without feeling what I'd felt that first time. Some things, if you're lucky, don't diminish.